Hey everyone, just wanted to do a quick tutorial on how I accomplished a sort of screen shattering effect that you might use in an RPG when transitioning from like an overworld to a battle. The only disclaimer I want to make real quick is that there are probably better and more efficient ways of doing this, but it's just sort of how I figured it out. So at a very basic level, what's happening is you're using two scene capture components that are sort of stacked on top of one another. The first is taking basically the last frame that the player camera sees, applies that to a destructible mesh, and then the other one is continuously looking at that destructible mesh as it shatters and applying that to a widget. Okay, so here we are in our blank third-person template project. The first thing you're going to want to do is go up to Edit, Plugins, and look for Apex Destruction. Make sure this is enabled. If it isn't, click this little box. You will have to restart the editor if you need to enable it. We'll need this in a little bit, so it's best just to do this now. Okay, so I'm going to go into my player character blueprint, and the first thing I'm going to do real quick is click on my camera and click Constrain Aspect Ratio. So I'm just going to do this so that when I play in the editor, the aspect ratio will be what I expect it to be, you know, like in a package project. So it's like 16 by 9. Alright, so going back into here, what we're going to do is we're going to click on Follow Camera, and we're going to add a Scene Capture Component 2D. Now this is the thing that is going to be grabbing basically the last frame that the camera sees before the transition happens. And so it's very important that the frame that it's grabbing is the same thing basically that the camera is seeing. So the camera and the scene capture component, their transforms need to be the same, the perspectives and their field of views need to be the same. So that's why it's attached to the follow camera, so that wherever the camera goes, the capture component will do the same. So if we then go down to scene capture, we can see that the scene capture component needs a target texture. Now, this texture is a special kind of texture called the render target, which the editor should have some defaults already, but we're just going to make our own. So if you go up here to create new asset, click render target, we'll call this render target 1. So then if we just take a look at that real quick and see what it is. So this is kind of what the interface for it looks like. The things that are important to note are size X and size Y. Since we're going for a 1080p 16 by 9 viewport, we're just going to do 1920 by 1080. And then target gamma. This may be different for you. It may be different depending on sort of how your scene looks in its out setup, but for me, about 1.4 seems to work. At least it seems to be close enough. Alright, so let's save that and close that out for now. We also want to change capture source here to final color in RGB. This will potentially be different. You kind of have to just see which one works best for you. And then the other thing you need to do, it's really important that capture every frame and capture on movement are both unchecked. If either of these are checked, it's basically going to continually capture frames and update the texture, which we don't want it to do. We just want the single last frame as the transition triggers. Alright, so now to get the scene capture component to actually capture the scene when we want it to, we're just going to drag it out into the space here, drag off of it, and type capture scene. And then we need some kind of event or input to trigger this. So we'll just do, say, keyboard F for right now. So now every time we press F, this capture component is going to grab a frame and assign it to that texture. So we can actually test that out real quick. So I go up here, look up at the sky, press F, and we see that this updated. We can do it again real quick, just to make sure. And again, it's updated. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is assign this render target texture to a material, because we're going to put this onto a destructible mesh. So just right click this, create material, call it a matte render T1. Let's go click into that, and we'll see here's our texture hooked up to the base color. What we need to do here is click on the render or the material settings and make sure that the shading model is set to unlit. This is because we want all of the lighting information to come from the texture itself and not from light sources in the actual environment. And that will make a little bit more sense later on. So just drag the RGB into the emissive color. And that's good for now. So before we move on to the Destructible Mesh, we're just going to create one more material real quick, which will be the material, just call this material glass. So this will basically just be the material on the Destructible Mesh where the render target isn't. So it's basically the glass or whatever you'd want it to be, concrete or just nothing. So we use a vector parameter for our color. I'm also going to make this unlit, and the color I'll just make it like kind of like a light to medium blue, just so we can see it. Okay. So now let's create our destructible mesh that this is all going to be applied to. So you can obviously create your own in a external program like Maya or Blender, or what you can do is you can go to geometry and drag in a box. This already has this glass material applied to it because I had it highlighted, which is actually kind of what we want anyway. But then let's click on this face, which will be our front face, and I'm just going to drag this material onto it. And so, because we know we want a 16:9 screen, we have to make sure that this is set to the right proportions. So Z I'm going to say is 90, Y I'm going to say is 160, and X I'm going to say is 2. So 16:9, and then, you know, this thickness will be kind of mimicking whatever you want it to be. So like a plane of glass would be relatively pretty thin. So maybe actually like 1.5, but that can be whatever you want. And then real quick, we need to make sure that this is set properly so that the UV matches the shape. All we need to do is select this face, go up to geometry alignment, and then select align surface fit. And then that will fit the face. Okay, so now we need to turn this into a static mesh. So if you go down to brush settings, this area might be hidden for you. If it is, just click this little show advanced button and then click create static mesh. And we'll call this static mesh underscore glass. Just create that. We'll go over here, right click that, go up to create destructible mesh. Just wait a second while it pops in. There it is. Alright, and there are a whole bunch of settings you can do for this. I'm just going to keep it real basic and simple here. I'm going to click accumulate damage. I don't really know that you need to do that, but I did it before and it worked for me. So cell count, let's just raise it up to like 75. Click fracture mesh so we can see what it looks like. That looks pretty good to me. Obviously, you know, you can change the size of these, how many there are, the seed, all that kind of stuff. But this looks good for testing purposes. Alright, so let's save that, close it. So now again, we can do another test and make sure that this is working. We can remove this right now and just drag the destructible mesh into the world, play, and then when we press F, this should update. Great. Now we're going to create a blueprint actor that will contain the destructible mesh, a scene capture component, and what is essentially a green screen. So you could just do a regular blueprint actor, or if you want, you can go to blueprint and type in scene capture, and then go to scene capture 2D. We'll call this glass break BP. And so the difference between this and a regular actor is just that it essentially puts a capture component in here for you. So before we kind of do the settings for the capture component, let's click on the root and add a destructible, which is going to be our destructible mesh. For some reason it doesn't always show up. Not quite sure why, to be honest with you. But it's there. We're also going to add a plane. And this is going to be our green screen. And we just want to make sure that this is quite large so that the camera essentially can't see past it. And that it's also behind the destructible. Real quick, it would be nice to have this capture component be a orthographic projection, but I found that for some reason it doesn't really work well with the textures and materials and render targets, all that, and unlit materials and stuff. So I just do this with a perspective camera. It doesn't really seem to be all that big of a deal. The only thing is you just need to sort of test how close and how far your destructible will be, so that the edges of the destructible match up with the edges of the frame of the capture component. And so for me, it generally works around 80. So we'll just go with that for right now. And we may need to adjust that, but for now that should be fine. Okay, so let's make our green screen material real quick. So we'll do a new material. Call this matte. I'll call this, chroma key. And let's do a vector parameter. Also going to make this unlit because we just want it to be a solid color with no lighting on it. This color can technically be whatever you want. You can also just make it the standard chroma green. I don't really remember exactly what that is, so I'll just kind of eyeball it a little bit. And that should be fine for now. Alright, close that, and then we're just gonna click on this plane and apply that to there. So we can test this out again real quick. If we take this blueprint and drag it out into the world, just kind of move it around over here, and we can see that that's updating. Okay, so going back into this blueprint, so now we can deal with this second scene capture component. And it's a little bit different than the first one. So we see that it also needs a texture target, so we're going to create a second texture target. So again, render target, and we'll call this render target 2. Let's go into that real quick before we forget, and again, make sure that this is set to 1920 by 1080, 1.4. For this one, I found it better to leave this as the first option, the default option, scene color, HDR and RGB. We want to make sure the composite mode is overwrite, because this scene capture is going to be updating every frame, and we want it to replace itself every time and not just add them, stack them on top of one another. And so we'll disable capture on movement and leave capture every frame checked. Because again, we're essentially creating a video by updating this texture every frame. Now what we're going to do is take this second scene capture render target, and we're going to again create a new material. Call this matte render T2. And this one is going to be a little bit different. So we're going to be applying this material to a widget. So we need to first of all set the material to make its material domain user interface. and we need to make sure that its blend mode is translucent, because we're going to be creating an alpha essentially between the parts where these sort of shards of glass are. And to do that, we're going to right click and create chroma key alpha node. We're going to plug the RGB of our texture into the Luma mask, into the image color. We are then going to create a vector parameter, and let's call this chroma key. And this needs to be the same color as this. So if we just go, we find that material, go back in here, just copy this value. And click into here, paste that, and then this will go into the chroma color. So now anywhere that this color shows up in this texture, it's going to become a part of the alpha channel. And that will be all the spaces between the shards as they move about and separate. The other thing you need to do is add a scalar parameter. Set it to 0.2. Unfortunately, I can't really tell you why this works or is needed. I don't really understand exactly how all of this works, to be honest. But if you just plug this into the cutoff minimum and cutoff maximum, that seems to work for me. You may need to adjust these values a little bit depending on how your scene is set up. Make sure the RGB of our texture is plugged in final color, and the alpha of the chroma key is plugged into opacity. So now we are going to create a widget which will take that material, apply it to an image, and then that's going to be put on the screen when the transition is happening. So if we go to user interface, create widget, just call this widget glass break. Go into here. So all we need to do here is add an image. And I'm going to make sure that it just fits the screen. And then real quick, what I'm going to also do is wrap the canvas with a size box and set the overrides to 1920 by 1080, and then wrap that with a scale box. And so basically this way, this widget will always conform to the 16:9 aspect ratio, no matter what size or shape the viewport is. And so for this image, we just need to apply our material. And so that's basically all we need to do for that for right now. And so now if we go into our third person character, the first thing we need to do is spawn actor from class. So we're going to spawn that glass break actor that we created. We need it to have a transform. So we'll just do that to make a transform. You want this to be set somewhere so that the player will never possibly see it or interact with it in any way, just, way off screen. It's probably best to be underneath the world, but it can basically be wherever you want. One thing I forgot to do, I forgot to actually make sure that I assign this. Okay, so glass break. And another thing I forgot to do is destructible. We want to disable gravity so that it doesn't fall when it spawns. Also so that when the pieces break, they can sort of hang in the air for a little bit and not just immediately fall down. I mean, you may want to keep that, but for this demo, we'll turn that off right now. Okay, so then after we spawn this actor into the world, we're going to create a widget. which is the widget that the material is being applied to. So widget glass break. We're going to add that to the viewport. You don't need to do this, but to make sure that it is on top of everything and there's no sort of UI materials over it, I'm going to set this 0 to 1. If you do have a bunch of other widgets, you may want to set this higher to make sure that nothing is above it. So we can test this again real quick before we add the destructible element to it, just to see. So if this goes right, the screen should look like it freezes when I press F. And what you can see here is, see how it's kind of brighter a little bit, doesn't quite look the same. That is, dealing with the gamma of the textures and the dynamic range settings of them. So that's stuff you might have to play with a little bit, but it's close enough for now. So, alright, so now pretty much we just need to add the destructive element to it. So if we go back into glass break BEP and go to the event graph, we don't need the tick. Oh, and before anything else, I do want to just point out that this scene capture, because it is capturing every frame, we don't need to tell it to start capturing. It just automatically starts capturing itself. Alright, so if we grab our destructible and apply radius damage, connect that to event begin play. We want this damage to happen where it's located. You could set this somewhere else, depending on, if you want the damage to come from the side or something, you don't want all the pieces to move in a certain direction. Damage, we'll set this to 500 for now, 10, 400. We'll probably have to adjust all this, but let's just do that for right now. And alright, let's test that out again. So this should, I press F, explode into pieces. Those pieces do sort of explode a little too much, perhaps. We can turn maybe the impulse strength down. And then what we can also do is we can put in a delay. Let's say like 1 second. Oops. And then when that's done, we can grab this and say gravity, set enable gravity. So now if we press F here, they explode, and then all the pieces fall. And then just as cleanup, what we can do is then say put another delay, and then say, I don't know, 1.5 seconds maybe, and then just destroy actor, because we don't want this thing sitting around when it's off screen. And like, if we're gonna call this again, we don't want multiple of these in the world at the same time. Also, we could do something similarly here and say off of event construct, we can put a delay and say 3 seconds, which should be enough time to cover the entire effect. And just say remove from parent, just to make sure that this also is removed from the UI stack. And that should be it. So obviously there's a lot of different settings you can change to sort of fit how you would like it to look for your own project, but that's sort of basically how to get it up and running. Obviously in this example we aren't actually transitioning to a different gameplay type, but you'd probably change the camera either through possessing another character or setting the view target. But yeah, if you have any questions, if there's anything that wasn't clear, leave a comment, let me know, and I'll try to answer them. And thanks for watching.